I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mershan, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mershan, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the show, we welcome back Israeli pollster Dahlia Scheindlin to discuss her recent tour of the United States and her contribution to the new book available now for free from the Carnegie Endowment. It's in ebook form for free, I should say, entitled Suppressing Dissent, Shrinking Civic Space, Transnational Repression, and Palestine-Israel. Dahlia's chapter in the book is entitled The Rise, Weakening, and Resurgence of Civil Society in Israel. Essentially, this episode will be a brief history of civil society in Israel and its relationship with Palestinian civil society. And with that being said, let's get to the conversation. I want to welcome back to Parallax Views a guest I'm very excited to be speaking with. I hold her in very high regard. She's an expert on public opinion in Israel. She's sort of the Israeli poll whisperer for many of us in the U.S. I very much appreciate her work. How are you doing, Dahlia Scheindlin?
Thank you for having me again. I'm doing as well as possible, personally okay, but the situation is very dire.
Now, you've been in the U.S. For a tour recently. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and your experiences? I'm just curious what it's been like.
Sure. I'm here on a speaking tour right now. Just to clarify for listeners, I live in Tel Aviv. I've been living there for 27 years. And I have been on I think this is my fourth speaking tour in the US, and well, I should say North America, because on this trip I was in Canada too, since the war started. Remember that I had a book that came out just a few weeks before the war began, so I already had a tour largely comprised of United States universities in the United States That was booked already for late October 2023. And since then, there has been a very intensive, ongoing demand or requests for me to come and give talks analyzing the situation of the war, Israeli politics, public opinion, dynamics in the region. And I've just been getting, in some ways, an overwhelming amount of interest from American communities, again, largely universities, but not limited to universities. So there are also lots of community events, some Jewish community events, et cetera. But there seems to be a kind of never-ending appetite to hear an analysis of the situation.
I was curious, then we can get into the main reason I've had you on the show. What has your experience been in regards to how do you think there's a difference in how Americans understand what is happening in Israel, Palestine, and how Palestinians and Israelis understand what is happening? Are there misunderstandings that those of us in America have? Or even is there misunderstandings that diaspora populations, Jewish and Palestinian, have about Israel, Palestine that Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East may not have?
What you're asking is there a gap in terms of how people abroad, but particularly Jewish or Palestinian diaspora communities, perceive what's going on in the region versus how Israelis and Palestinians experience what's going on? And it's true, in the early phases of the war, I sort of had an insight, and I wrote a whole analysis about how the gaps were, becoming enormous between what the two sides are going through. But we're really talking about is four sides: Israelis, Palestinians in the region, diaspora communities of both sides outside the region, and then there's a fifth side, or you could say fifth and sixth, which are supporters of each side separately, who are not necessarily Jewish or Israeli, who are not necessarily Palestinian, but in those camps. And they all experience things somewhat differently. I'm not sure if I have one way to characterize the difference now, but I think that what I sensed, certainly in the early phases of the war, when everybody saw everything as extremely zero sum, that the biggest difference was that the pro-Israel communities thought that Israel was basically justified doing anything without taking into account just how devastating the consequences of this war are for Israelis as well as Palestinians, and what it means to be a country doing what Israel has been doing to Palestinians. And there was sort of no interest in that, from what I could see, in the pro-Israel communities abroad. From the Palestinian perspective, I think that the pro-Palestinian movements abroad had, for a long time, or certainly again in those very early phases when everything was viewed in a zero-sum way, deeply diminished the level of suffering that the Palestinians living in Gaza were going through. And I say deeply diminished because their entire, rallying cry seemed to focus on supporting resistance in the form of, legitimizing resistance against Israel without taking into account the consequences, first of all, of committing crimes, violating international law, certainly, and simple crimes of decency against civilians on the Israeli side, as if that didn't matter. And secondly, that the Palestinians in Gaza were the ones paying the price for this, what for the supporters abroad fit neatly into a theoretical framework of anti-colonialism, but which ultimately meant a great deal of death and destruction among Palestinians. And I think that those gaps, it's hard for me to say what the impact of them was. I mean, it's a good thing that there's global attention to the issue, but none of those perspectives managed to stop the war, which would have been the best thing for all communities involved. Stopping the war in the early stages would have been grounded in an exchange of Israeli hostages being held by Hamas for Palestinian prisoners. So Israelis would have had the hostages back. The war would have ended at an earlier stage. Fewer Palestinians would have been killed. And frankly, none of the various movements, well, certainly the pro-Palestinian movements, weren't able to achieve that result. But then again, nobody's been able to achieve that result, not even the US president. So the gaps are there. I think that people who are interested in this conflict abroad and feel that they should be taking one side or the other, it's really incumbent upon them to first of all respect the people who are living through it. It's not to say that you can't have an opinion from abroad. I fully support people having an opinion on conflicts far away, but the condition is that you have to actually know about it, and you have to place a priority and a premium on the people who are living through it. And I don't always feel that was the case abroad.
Now, the big reason I wanted to have you on the show again was I was reading through a book that the Carnegie Endowment recently released entitled "Suppressing Dissent," which was co-edited by a friend of the show, Zaha Hassan, and I was pleasantly surprised to see you made a contribution to it.
Why were you surprised?
Well, because I just didn't realize I was reading through it and I'm like, oh, I noticed Dahlia's name. That's why I was just like, oh, this is awesome. Uh, but you had a piece in there entitled "The Rise, Weakening, and Resurgence of Civil Society in Israel." Maybe you could talk a little bit about. I mean, for people that aren't familiar with the jargon, what do we mean by civil society, and how has it evolved in Israel over time?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question to think about how to define civil society. I think of it as sort of a sandwich. The heart of the sandwich, the good stuff, which is kind of at the bottom level, you have the regular people who are just people like you and me going about our lives, working, trying to get through the day, trying to pay our bills and, be good family members, et cetera. And then you have political actors who are sitting in government. They are either elected officials or work for the government, in other capacities. And those are the ones who are supposed to be making and implementing the policy that shapes our lives. And in the middle, you have people who have come from the bottom. They are grassroots, just regular people who are not elected officials, who are not representing a government agency. And they've decided that they want to try to change policy as civic organizations, right? Just civic, just being another word for, the people in a polity. And so they have organized themselves to be more effective. They've started organizations. It can be in any field in the world, right? It can be political activism. It can be, education policy. It could be social welfare, right? Charity organizations. It could be, trying to lobby for awareness of things like autism or, child abuse or any topic under the sun, basically. And these kinds of organizations are important because they provide the citizens' voice in a more organized fashion to try to coordinate how citizens can bring their preferences upwards towards the political level. They provide a check and balance on government power. I mean, it's not an institutional check and balance, but the free expression of ideas and the ability to organize is certainly a basic civil liberty in democratic countries for that reason, so that it can provide the kind of amplifying and lobbying force to the government so that it's more responsive to its citizens on these various aspects. And it can express political dissent. And now that's a subset of civil society, right? Civil society doesn't necessarily have to do with changing, policy on ideological issues. It can simply be, I mean, nothing simple, but it could focus in a limited way on, providing charity to needy families without trying to change government policy, for example. And what we see is that a healthy democracy, certainly a healthy liberal democracy, will have a robust civil society where you have, freedom for people to organize, establish their organizations, express political opinions, meet with elected officials to try to present the case for, the issues that how the government should manage the issues they care about. So that's in a very, very general sense. Of course, there's a huge literature on what exactly civil society is, how to define it, that goes way beyond what I just said. But one mark of either undemocratic societies or societies that where you see democratic aspects of their culture eroding, or even, let's say, transitional democracies that are backsliding. One of the very clear hallmarks is that they will try to constrain the freedom of civil society because they don't want outside criticism of the government. They don't want the people to have the kind of voice to be able to communicate what communities of activists or communities of regular people represented by the activists want. And they don't want opposition, in various independent forms. So what we see in Israel is, again, it would be too long to go into a whole history lesson, but I do think you can identify 3 and maybe now 4 clear phases. In the earliest, decades of statehood, civil society existed, but the state in general was very heavily centralized. You had essentially one party leading the government for the first nearly 30 years, even though Israel had elections. And one of the reasons that party was able to keep winning elections was because it had an effective de facto kind of influence or even partial control over numerous other state agencies, just because, it goes back to the history of prior to independence, how those institutions were born of certain ideological movements, and one of them became more dominant and then carried over into the early decades of statehood. That's David Ben-Gurion's party, Mapai. And, there was so much overlap between the ruling party and all of these state agencies. When I say state agencies or other institutions, including even the army, and including arms of the media, and including, let's say, the Jewish Agency, which is the agency that was responsible for immigration, or the Histadrut, the Federation of Labor Unions, that the party, the ruling party, had a huge and semi-captive audience. And so they kept getting more, reelected, in an environment where people were basically surrounded by that party's kind of message, and in some ways even coercive on some level, because the Labor Federation was the institution that provided people's healthcare. So to get healthcare, you kind of had to be affiliated with it, and therefore you had a self-reinforcing microcosm. And as a result, civil society, there were independent organizations, but they weren't as effective. And the ethos of the country at that time didn't really promote, vibrant opposition to the government's policies on the most sensitive issues of the country. And because the state was more centralized, organized in some ways around socialist principles. So the social welfare infrastructure was very strong, right? David Ben-Gurion's party had socialist leanings, or let's say social democratic. And as a result, the material needs of most citizens were largely met with all of the hardships of the early years of statehood. But what happened over time was that in many ways, the centralization of the state began to, I think, in a natural process, but also due to an eventual change of power, to a more liberal-oriented party, liberal right-wing-oriented party, which may sound strange to some listeners. That's Likud, that's Netanyahu's party today. But that transition happened in 1977, and one of the things that they began to do was, reduce the size of the state, cut down the level of control. I mean, certainly they replaced the control, or began replacing the control of the earlier party over, so many aspects of life in Israel. And they also ended up reducing social services in a lot of ways. And so what you saw was the emergence of a growing independent kind of community of civil society groups, partly for social welfare and charity organizations that became more robust. But over time, as Israeli society became more liberalized, and its values also shifted away from a collectivist, some even conformist ethos, and Israel got past its most existential wars, what you saw was greater diversity of opinions, greater kind of cultural space for expressing political dissent, and an extremely controversial policy that began in 1967 of occupying Palestinian territories, capturing the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, at that time also the Golan Heights and Sinai in the war. And that policy generated a lot of political controversy. So as you see the emergence of an independent civil society in the 70s and 80s, you also have the beginnings of a very serious kind of political dissent, which, in some ways, because the party representing the people who were opposed to the occupation, and this is a bit of a leap, I would have to explain it a little further, but people who were associated with the old Labor Party, that would have been, which David Ben-Gurion represented in the early years of statehood, many of them became critical of the occupation within those first 20 years. And so they were not in power, or they were going back and forth in coalition governments, but they were not in power the way they used to be. And I think for that combination of reasons, they began supporting organizing themselves as civilians, and developing groups that tried to criticize the policy and advocate for not having a permanent occupation, advocate against settlements, support peace agreements. And over the decades, I would say in the 1990s, Israel became even more liberal in certain aspects of its legal and political culture. And with that, we saw the flourishing of civil society, increasingly vibrant and diverse civil society organizations, particularly political groups, including on the right wing, not only on the left. So it should be said, this is not a one-sided project. So I would say, like in many things in Israeli society, that process reached, a kind of zenith in the 1990s and even in the 2000s, especially as opposition to the occupation grew as well. However, with the return of Netanyahu in 2009 to his second term as prime minister after he was a leader in the 1990s, around the first decade of the 2010s, in general, Israel began to see a kind of reversal of its liberalizing trend and increasing attempts to constrain the institutions of liberal democracy. We saw the early stage criticism of the judiciary at that time, eventually turning into full-blown attacks on the Supreme Court and other aspects of the judiciary. And at the same time, we saw increasing backlash and criticism against certain NGOs, non-governmental organizations, particularly those that were critical of Israel's policies in the occupied territories. And that's where you see early stage legislation to try to constrain their activities, but also to try to demonize them, which is something that is characteristic of the countries that are going through democratic backsliding. And that process continued throughout the 2020s.
If you could, I was wondering if you could speak more in specific terms about what I think you've referred to as the assault on civil society that took place during this time.
Yeah, that's a great question, because that phase, which I'm counting as kind of the third phase, right? The first phase being a kind of minimalist civil society, the second phase being a flourishing of civil society, and then the phase of the 2010s, let's say, from around 2009 through to the war, where you have, on the one hand, right-wing dominated legislatures proposing bills, okay, some of which eventually did pass into law, that either branded these organizations to be foreign agents on some level, or attempted to try to create such prohibitive taxation structures tailored to the kind of funding structures of the critical left-wing organizations, particularly those supporting Palestinian human rights, such that you would incapacitate those organizations without actually openly banning them. And even if they didn't pass those bills in the early stages. By the way, some of those bills have come back to the legislative table recently. But even if those bills don't pass, the public conversation around them legitimizes the attacks on those organizations, delegitimizes what they stand for, and takes up a great deal of resources of these critical NGOs that want to be giving their time to, for example, advocating for protection of Palestinian human rights under occupation, and instead they're paying lawyers and spending their staff and organizational time to fight back and lobby against their own government. Why did that happen? We should, walk through some of the reasons, even if it's brief. One of the main reasons had to do with the first round of many wars in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. In late 2008, in the beginning and leading into January 2009. And that war was so destructive, and Israel had conducted such extensive bombing that led to the deaths of huge numbers of civilians. I think there were over 2,000 Palestinian casualties at the time, that the UN established an investigative committee led by a South African justice, Richard Goldstone, who was Jewish himself, but the government was so angry, the Israeli government was so angry about him even investigating the possibility of war crimes. They saw it as an anti-Israel plot, that they refused to cooperate with his commission. But the human rights organizations, being independent of government control, some of them had been collecting research and documentation and did cooperate with the commission. Or the commission was simply able to use their documentation, which was public anyway. And so what you had was a bunch of, I think, an increasing conversation among influential right-wing figures, whether they were politicians or media commentators, who were furious that independent Israeli organizations would dare to cooperate with an investigative commission from the United Nations, which Israel considers to be anti-Semitic, investigating war crimes, which they see as an affront to Israel's right to self-defense, and started demonizing those NGOs as a fifth column, as traitors. The rhetoric at the time was very severe, and that laid the groundwork for some of the bills that we have seen throughout the course of the decade, trying to intimidate or constrain those organizations. And again, the legislation goes on today. Some of those have passed into law, particularly the ones identifying them as foreign funding or some sort of foreign entities. But also, like I said, there's the bill that's come back to try to tax them practically out of existence. If the current form of the bill passes, they will be practically, non-viable anymore.
In that regard, I'm curious, are there parallels to be drawn between, I want to word this carefully, some of the tactics we see on the sort of American right wing today and the sort of MAGA right wing and sort of the hardline Israeli right? Is there sort of this, the deep state is trying to hurt our country and the elite cabals? Is that sort of used in Israel the way it is used in the US by the right wing here?
It is absolutely used in Israel. In fact, our prime minister has accelerated his usage of the term deep state lately. He used to only say it once in a while, but kind of imply it. Now he says it very freely, particularly over the last few weeks. But again, the deep state is a little bit different from NGOs. It's true that he portrays them, and people who agree with Netanyahu's perspective portray them all as a kind of cabal of liberal universalist left-wingers who are imposing these values on society that run counter to the true spirit of the people. And within that cabal, the deep state refers to a kind of, unelected bureaucrats within the layers of government who are secretly trying to control the government because they can't get elected by popular vote. Whereas NGOs don't totally fall into that because they're not hiding anything. They are open about their activities. They are not pretending to be elected officials, and they're not within government. However, they are regularly accused of having an ulterior agenda to their stated goal of protecting human rights. And their detractors portray them as having an agenda of undermining the Jewish identity of the state of Israel, because that some of them support Palestinian human rights, implying that those two are somehow contradictory, which I think is an assumption that everybody should realize is false. There's no zero sum between protecting Palestinian human rights or ending occupation practices which violate Palestinian human rights, and having a Jewish identity to the state of Israel. Of course, Jewish identity has many, many manifestations. In a maximalist form, it can be exclusive, which is how it's defined in Israel's nation state law, as an exclusive national identity that excludes others. But yes, to get back to your question, there are definitely parallels in terms of how countries like Turkey, Egypt, Russia, Hungary, and increasingly the US are dealing with their civil society communities and trying to both undermine them on the legislative level and vilify them.
I just had a few more brief questions. I know we're short on time, but what can be learned from, you mentioned that period in, the 1970s where there's this transition of power with the Likud rising, and a lot of civil society organizations sort of had to fill a void during that time. Are there lessons we can learn from that for today, I guess? Is there a renewal of that need for civil society to step in where government has maybe failed?
Well, this is a controversy within civil society because people think the government should take responsibility for taking care of basic needs of its citizens. But what I think the real parallel now is not so much, well, I mean, yes, there is a huge need for better government policies with relation to social welfare. But I think the parallel now that is more urgent in Israel, I mean, I hate to say more urgent because social welfare systems are desperately need better policies in Israel too. But I would say that the gap is about the politics. In other words, and this brings me to the fourth stage, right, of where civil society is in Israel, which is what's happened since October 7th, but also actually since 2023, which is a huge mobilization of civil society in ways that almost seem like, imagine that you have an entity that somebody has been trying to suffocate for 10 years, and then it comes roaring back. That is basically what Israeli civil society has done in the wake of the government's assault on the judiciary in 2023, when you saw an extraordinary, really unprecedented mobilization, and I don't say that word lightly, but there has been an extraordinary mobilization of Israeli civilians, just regular people, who took incredible initiative to mount massive demonstrations ongoing for 39 weeks. They would have gone into a 40th week had it not been for October 7th in 2023. And basically to fill in for protecting democratic institutions where the state was trying to openly assault them. And then after the war began, it was civil society who took care of Israeli citizens who were displaced by the tens of thousands. We had possibly over 150,000 Israelis displaced, and the government was absent. The state was absent by all accounts. In other words, you can probably find some examples somewhere of people who felt the state took care of them, but for the most part, there was no plan. And people banded together. Private owners of hotels opened the doors of their hotel chains for free so that they could take the displaced. People mobilized to have clothes, food, drugstore item drives all over the country to send to 300,000 reservists who were called up, and there was no capacity to absorb them in their army bases. I mean, the state was gone, and everybody felt it because we felt it on October 7th as well. The state wasn't prepared for the attack and wasn't able to respond to the attack, and that became a kind of metaphor for how the state dealt with the welfare of its citizens immediately after the attack, which was that it didn't. And civil society stepped in. In fact, it was an incredible coincidence that many of the organizations that had established themselves in a vast infrastructure that had self-generated during 2023 was in place and was able to just completely transform into these kind of civic support efforts for displaced people and soldiers all over the country. And that eventually, over the months and over the course of 2024, has morphed into the infrastructure for protests against the government for its policy of avoiding a deal that would release all of the Israeli hostages from Gaza and reach a ceasefire in the war, and ultimately has rallied the same people who were critical of the government already in 2023 for its failures and its attacks on democracy. And so I would call that the fourth phase, the resurgence of civil society, which honestly, every day I'm surprised by some new initiative that I hear about, and it's on many fronts. It can be in terms of helping to rehabilitate the southern communities, supporting agriculture, social workers organizing to try to help communities, and various, constant efforts to renew the types of pressure put on the government to, achieve the things that I talked about before.
Just two more questions. I'll let you get going. The first one is, this book, Suppressing Dissent, deals a lot with civil society, Palestinian civil society. Your contribution deals with Israeli civil society. So it leads to the question of where is the sort of cross-pollination between the two? How do they at times work together? Just can you speak to the ways in which these two civil societies come together or maybe come into conflict at times? What's the relationship with each other, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, I think there are really two levels to the question, or if you didn't mean for there to be two levels, I'm going to answer it on two levels. One is like, what is the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, both in Israel, where we have 2 million Palestinian citizens who have been there since before the establishment of statehood. I mean, not in those numbers, but who are citizens of Israel. And then there's Palestinians under occupation in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And I think that how do they work together? So for one thing, the organizations, the actual mobilized and organized, formal organizations within civil society, depending on what they work on, they might work together. So if they're all working on occupation-related violations of human rights of Palestinians, they may work together, they may coordinate, they may conduct joint projects sometimes. It can be very sensitive because there's also a stream of Palestinian civil society that believes in not normalizing relations with Israel at any level, including even on civil society. So there are sensitivities around those kinds of cooperative efforts. But they do happen, and sometimes they're formal and sometimes they're not formal. And then the other thing that I really think is important to amplify is that there are civil society organizations that have managed to bring people together for the kinds of activities that are designed to pressure the government to either end the war, reach a ceasefire, and get a hostage release, end the occupation. Right? There have been anti-war, anti-occupation demonstrations of Israelis and Palestinians from the West Bank during this war. They were organized by communities that are basically part of civil society, including Palestinians and Israelis who work together on organizing them. And it's not that easy to do because even finding a physical space for those communities to meet is very difficult due to the restrictions of the occupation. So those things do happen. And I think that civil society, for example, I think nobody can fail to notice the role of an organization called Standing Together, which, people can be, it's an organization that promotes, I would say, Jewish and Palestinian solidarity within citizens of Israel for the most part, over shared social causes, including opposing the occupation. This is long before the war began, and now opposing the occupation and the war, and even openly calling for refusal to serve in this war. And that organization has been around for years. They are very grassroots, and they really have done a good job of recruiting lots of young people, Jewish and Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel over the years. And during the war, they've become kind of the leaders in really legitimizing calls for a ceasefire, for an end of the war, and for an end of occupation, and for solidarity between these two communities, and for shining a spotlight on the value of every life of every citizen, civilian, I should say, and especially children who have been killed. Very few others are willing to really make that case in Israeli society. So I think that they have a prominent role. But remember, these are not equal situations. Palestinian civil society is operating under much more severe constraints and much more severe punishment from numerous authorities. They can be constrained by the Israeli authorities. They can be shut down. They can be, harassed, intimidated, and by the Palestinian Authority. And that's not to mention Hamas, which is not only a repressive regime like the PA and like Israel's occupation, but it is, well, I'm not sure if I should really say that. I was going to say it's much more violent, but each of those, I mean, specifically with relation to how it treats civil society. But of course, the first two that I mentioned are also violent when it comes to repression of civil society. So it's much more difficult for Palestinian civil society groups to operate freely, depending on their social cause, right? I imagine if it's just a charity, then they won't face, too much trouble. But if it's anything to do with independent, not even, let's say, regardless of what the position is, as long as it's independent leaning and critical of any of the authorities, I imagine they're going to face, not just I imagine, I know they face a great deal of physical intimidation, including, to efforts to shut them down or even imprison activists, etc.
Very last question I wanted to ask you, and this may be a bit complex, so I know we'll have to maybe be brief about it, but I think there's this mentality, especially after October 7th, amongst a lot of people that, well, now views are more hardened on than ever on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side. Oh, there's been full-throated support for the war in Israeli polling. However, there's also this abysmal level of trust in the government and the prime minister in that same polling.
It's
I
true.
think though that people are there's some people that seem to think, well, this issue is completely insurmountable. The stances on both sides have hardened too much. I know the future is unpredictable, but is there any silver lining? Do you think we can overcome that mentality that you know everyone has become too hard line and nothing can be done?
Of course. I mean, I would say this isn't just my wishful thinking. The fact is that conflicts have ended in other parts of the world, some of them much more brutal than this one. Although it's hard to quantify when every single life is, a bitter loss of civilians. And I think that, if you could see an end to what happened in Rwanda in 1994, which was, 800,000 people slaughtered within a matter of 3 months, and that country is anything but an ideal example. But the violence has not been resurgent, for over 30 years now. Same thing with the Balkan Wars and the dissolution of Yugoslavia, which there were incidents that counted as genocide according to international courts, a great deal of slaughter and violence and expulsion. And again, those countries may be rife with problems, and the conflicts are not even formally resolved, but we have not seen a resurgence of conflict-related violence, again, in about 30 years in those places. World War II. Can you imagine a more barbaric manifestation of human evil? It's hard to imagine. I mean, nothing had ever been conceived of before in terms of the level of death and destruction. And nevertheless, we have the most stunning example of peaceful relations between European countries who even formed an alliance that is essentially states in a confederated arrangement where they keep their sovereignty, but cooperate and have open borders and a shared economic zone and a lot of shared values and institutions. And so, for one thing, again, this is not my opinion. These are examples we have from modern history, and they are very concrete examples. And I think the second answer is that we have no choice. There's a moral imperative to end the slaughter of innocent people, to end wars that will lead to more slaughter of innocent people. And by innocent people, I mean civilians on either side. This is not to create a power equivalency. Israel is vastly more powerful than the Palestinians, whether you think that's a good thing or not a good thing. I think anybody can agree to that is the case right now. But the current political constellation that's been in place, those power relations, the fact that Palestinians do not have self-determination over their own fate, and that Israel has been implementing, frankly, a cruel military occupation over both the West Bank and Gaza. Let's be clear, Jerusalem is a little bit of a different story, but not much different. That is what has led us to this situation, and that has to be named, and so policy can change. And so the two sides can reach a framework that allows for Palestinians to have self-determination and control over their fate like every other people, long since recognized by the United Nations. And it's not going to solve every problem, and it won't lead to zero violence between Israelis and Palestinians, because human nature means that there is always some conflict and violence in society. But the level that we've reached now is beyond anything that should ever have been tolerated. And it also was not a surprise.
In that regard, do you think you mentioned at the end of this essay that the ongoing occupation and the deadly sort of conflict management approach has not worked. I mean, trying to just suppress Palestinians in perpetuity has just led to acts of retribution, anger. Do you think we're finally moving towards a point where, this is not going to hold anymore, and that there's going to be pushback against that sort of business as usual approach that we saw in the past? And that'll be the last question, I promise.
Well, I wonder, if you're referring to some actor in particular when you say this won't hold anymore, because I mean, I think what happened on October 7th, there can be no question of justifying it. It was unjustified by any measure. But at the same time, there was also no question that an unresolved conflict that involves a military occupation controlling millions of people for decades would inevitably produce cycle after cycle of violence with increasing brutality. Many of us said that for years and years before October 7th because it was happening before our eyes. So no, the situation has not held and could not have held. And I feel like we've already seen the manifestation of how it cannot hold. So I don't know what else. Anybody, again, you asked about the gaps. Anybody living in the region knows that this is not a sustainable situation. Even Israelis, as belligerent as they may be right now, and they are also suffering because of the war, and they're very well aware of that too.
Well, thank you again, Dahlia Scheindlin, for coming on Parallax Views. I appreciate it, and I hope people will check out the book Suppress and Dissent from the Carnegie Endowment. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on again.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, I'd like to remind you that I am currently without any advertisers or sponsors. So it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible. Please support me on patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. The more support I get on that Patreon page, the more I can release these shows. So, again, patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.